Thessera Vex had a smell before a storm, sweet and metallic and electric all at once, like something ancient and enormous was waking up deep beneath the soil, exhaling through every crack and pore of the planet's surface. The air would turn thick and close, heavy as a wet wool against the skin, and the jungle would go unnaturally quiet. Every creature that knew what was coming already underground or high in the canopy, perfectly still, waiting. I know all this because Lyra taught me to read it. She'd been teaching me to read a lot of things in those first weeks: the color of the sky at different times of day and what each shade meant, which plants were safe to touch, and which ones left a burning rash that lasted for days. I learned that one the hard way on day 9, before my veiled vocabulary was good enough to understand her warning in time. The sound the pack hunters made when they were moving versus feeding versus sleeping. And the smell before a storm. On the morning of what I'd come to think of as day 23 on Thessera Vex, I stepped out of the shelter into air that tasted like copper and crushed green leaves and something sharp and ozone bright that made the back of my teeth ache. And I knew, before I even looked at the sky, that we weren't going anywhere today. I went back inside. Lyra was already repacking the supply packs, moving with that fluid efficiency that still stopped me cold sometimes, rearranging priorities with the calm certainty of someone who had lived through 100 of these storms and knew exactly what they demanded. She looked up when I came in, read my face. She was extraordinary at reading my face by then, better than most people who had known me for years, and gave a single, short nod. "I know," I said. She went back to packing. We had maybe 2 hours before it hit. What Lyra did in those 2 hours was, in retrospect, extraordinary. She moved through the shelter and around its perimeter with the focused intensity of a general preparing a fortification, reinforcing the layered selvage walls with additional bracing she had pulled from a cache I hadn't known existed, tucked behind a false panel in the ship's exterior hull, sealing gaps I thought were inconsequential with a thick paste she made from a plant resin and ground material dust that, when it dried in minutes in the pre-storm air, was harder than the metal around it. She handed me tasks without words, pointed, mimed, waited just long enough to confirm I understood, then moved on. There was a rhythm to working with her that I had been trying to describe to myself for days, without quite finding the right word for it. Synchronized, maybe, the way musicians who have never met can still play together if the music is clear enough. Outside, the sky was doing things that had no equivalent in any weather I'd experienced before. The bruised purple-black of an approaching Thesserian storm was laced throughout with veins of deep violet, as if the clouds themselves were alive and circulatory, pulsing with something that wasn't quite lightning. The air pressure had dropped enough that I could feel it in my eardrums, a constant low-grade pressure, like the planet was leaning in. The jungle had gone completely silent, not the ordinary quiet of early morning, not the held breath quiet of predators nearby. something deeper and more total. The silence of every living thing that knew what was coming, making itself as small as possible and hoping to be overlooked. Lyra finished the last of the exterior ceiling and came back inside, pulling the reinforced hatch shut behind her with a resonant metallic clang that sealed us in with the same finality as a vault door. She checked the seal with her fingertips, methodical, thorough, then turned to survey the interior. It was small. It had always been small, but somehow the sealed hatch made it feel smaller. 8 feet by maybe 12, the curved metal of the hull forming one wall and part of the ceiling, the salvage-built walls forming the rest, 2 sleeping mats on opposite sides, the carefully tended fire in its metal bowl at the center, supplies stacked with Lyra's geometric precision along the back wall, our expanding vocabulary display, a flat piece of whole metal where we had been scratching words in 2 scripts side by side, building our shared language one careful mark at a time. And the 2 of us, who had started as strangers and were becoming something that didn't have a word in either of our languages yet. The first crack of thunder hit. Not the rolling boom of a Terran storm, but something sharper and more percussive, like the sky splitting rather than rumbling, and outside the narrow viewport slit the rain began. A Thessaran storm is not a metaphor. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to describe might sound like I'm reaching for meaning that wasn't there. I'm not. The storm was precisely and exactly what it was, an atmospheric event of extraordinary violence, product of the planet's unstable geological core and its peculiar magnetic field, and the way 2 weather systems collided over the equatorial jungle belt every 30 days or so, with the patience and inevitability of tectonic plates. It was also the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. The rain came first, not in drops, but in shifting curtains of silver and gray, so dense it turned the jungle into a blurred watercolor painting of itself, all form and color bleeding into one another behind a veil of falling water. It drummed against the hull of the shelter in waves, now a whisper, now a roar, the sound rising and falling in patterns that were almost rhythmic, almost musical, as if the storm was composing something. Then the lightning, not the thin white bolts of human thunderstorms, but wide, branching electric blue rivers of light that crashed across the whole visible sky at once, turning the inside of the shelter from firelight amber to cold, brilliant white for one suspended, breathless second before the thunder arrived. Not a crack this time, but a deep, physical concussion boom that Cole felt in his chest and his spine at the soles of his feet through the floor. The wind followed, and the wind was a living thing. It shrieked through the narrow gaps in our ceiling, those tiny imperfections that Lyra had missed or accepted as necessary pressure releases, and each shriek was a different pitch, harmonics layering on top of each other, until the shelter was full of sound in a way a concert hall is full of sound, every surface resonating. I sat with my back against the hull wall and watched the storm through the narrow viewport slit and thought, this planet has been killing people for 2 100 years. And I think I understand why they came. Lyra was doing something with a piece of salvaged wire and a small component from my ship's navigation system. Working by firelight with the same focused patience she brought to everything. Her long fingers moved with delicate certainty, bending the wire into configurations I couldn't follow. Testing the tension, adjusting. I watched her work. That was something I'd been catching myself doing more often. Watching her work. It wasn't conscious exactly. She was simply remarkable to watch. The same way a master craftsman is remarkable to watch. The economy of movement. The total absence of wasted gesture. The sense that every small action was precisely considered and precisely executed. But it wasn't only that. The storm was doing something to the shelter. The pressure fluctuations, maybe, or the way the wind harmonics layered and shifted, that made the firelight move differently than usual. It rippled and flared and settled and rippled again. And in that restless amber light, Lyra's green-gray skin caught colors I hadn't noticed in steadier conditions. Warmth. Underneath the cool, mottled surface, the faintest golden undertone in the creases of her hands, the angle of her jaw, her amber eyes flicked up from the wire, caught mine. I should have looked away. The natural thing, the casual, nothing to see here thing, would have been to glance back at the viewport, or at the fire, or any of the dozen other things in the shelter that were easier to look at than she was in particular in that light. I didn't look away. Neither did she. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough to mean something. Short enough that neither of us had to decide what to do about the fact that it meant something. Then a particular savage gust hit the shelter sideways, and she went back to the wire. And I went back to watching the storm, and neither of us said anything at all. But the air in the shelter felt different after that. Warmer, maybe, or just more honest. We developed a habit in the evenings of working on our shared vocabulary wall. Taking turns, one of us would point at something, say its name in our own language, scratch the word into the whole metal, and then the other would add theirs beside it. Simple things at first. Water, fire, rock, sleep. Then more complex things that we both got more ambitious. Storm, wound, remember, afraid. That last one had been Lyra's contribution 3 days earlier. She pointed at herself, then at the jungle, then scratched the kale word with the sharpened bolt we used as a stylus, and looked at me. I'd added the human word beside it, afraid. She studied both words for a long time. Then she made a gesture I was coming to understand meant something like, I want to understand this better. She pointed at herself again, said the kale word, then pointed at the jungle again, specifically in the direction of the cargo containers we'd hidden on day 2, the ones she'd slammed shut and wouldn't let me open. Tonight, with the storm pressing the world down to the size of this one small shelter, she came back to it. She pointed at the vocabulary wall, at the word afraid, then at herself. Then slowly, with the deliberateness of someone choosing to say something difficult, she pointed in the direction of the containers. I waited. She struggled with it for a moment. I could see the effort, the reaching for something in our shared vocabulary that wasn't quite there yet. Then she pointed at the words we had: old, buried, find, danger. She said something in Kale, slow, careful, meant for me to try to follow. I caught maybe half of it. Enough. The containers held something connected to what was buried here. Something old. Something that people have been bringing to this planet, or trying to bring through it, for a very long time. And whatever it was the reason the planet had been eating ships for 200 years. Not bad luck. Not just dangerous terrain and apex predators. Someone had been making sure this planet stayed empty. Lyra, I said quietly, what's down there? She looked at me for a long time in the stormlight. Then she pointed at the word buried and added a new word to the wall: sacred. The storm peaked around what I estimated was midnight and began easing by the small hours. Not gone, but spent, the way fury burns itself down eventually into something quieter and steadier. We'd both drifted, not quite sleeping, not quite awake. That particular half-conscious state that comes from being warm and still after days of constant movement and alertness. I'd shifted at some point until my back was against the hull wall, legs stretched out toward the fire. Lyra had done the same on her side, closer to the supply wall. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, I came more fully awake and found the storm had gentled to a steady, soft rain, the kind that sounded against the metal hull like something between music and breath. The fire had burned low, throwing everything in deep amber and long shadow. The shelter smelled of rain and wood smoke and the faint, sweet mineral scent of Lyra's skin that I had stopped noticing consciously about a week ago, which I took as evidence that my brain had decided it belonged in the category of normal. Lyra was awake. I could tell by the quality of her stillness, the alert, aware stillness rather than the deeper kind. She was looking at the fire, not at me, her amber eyes half-lidded and thoughtful. After a while she said something, very quiet, barely above the sound of the rain. Not the careful, simplified Kale she used when she was trying to communicate something specific to me. The other kind. The full speed, full complexity, native speech that she used when she was thinking out loud. When she forgot or didn't care that I could only catch fragments. I caught fragments. Something about the storm. Something about staying. Something, and I wasn't certain of this, my Kale was still far from fluent, about not being alone in it. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I was supposed to. It felt less like something directed at me, and more like something she was telling the fire, or the rain, or herself. But after she went quiet, I said very softly, I know what you mean. She turned her head and looked at me then, and for a moment, her expression was completely unguarded. None of the careful watchfulness, none of the self-possessed calm, just something open and direct, and almost startlingly in its simplicity. Then she turned back to the fire, and we let the rain do the rest of the talking. Morning came the way mornings on Thessera Vex always did after a storm, with an almost aggressive beauty, as if the planet was apologizing. The air outside was scrubbed clean and crystalline, every surface beaded with rain drops that caught the early light and scattered it in tiny prismatic explosions. The jungle smelled extraordinary, every green and growing thing exhaling at once, rich and layered and complex as a cord. Even the wreckage field looked different in the post-storm light, all its sharp and broken edges softened under the standing water that had pooled in every depression. Lyra was already outside when I emerged, standing at the perimeter of the clearing we had made around the shelter, looking at the sky. The last of the storm clouds were moving off to the east, and what they left behind was a sky of deep, saturated violet blue that I still had no proper name for in English, and I suspected I never would. She heard me come out. She always heard me. Her senses were simply calibrated differently and better, but didn't turn around immediately. Just stood there for a moment, face turned upward, eyes closed. I stood next to her, and I looked at the sky too. After a while she said something, one word, in Kale, that I'd recognized from her vocabulary wall, a word she had taught me early on in the first week, that I'd been slowly understanding more deeply as the days went on. It was the word for beautiful. But in Kale, it wasn't only an aesthetic judgment, it carried something else inside it. A sense of value, of something worth protecting, of a feeling you wanted to remember. Beautiful and worth keeping. I stood there in the crystalline post-storm air of a planet that had no business being as extraordinary as it was, next to a woman from a species I hadn't known existed 3 weeks ago. And I thought about the word sacred that she had added to our shared wall the night before, and the cargo, and what was buried, and all the ships that had come here and never left. And I thought, I'm starting to understand why. Not why they died, why they came. I noticed in the morning light that something about her had changed overnight. I didn't have the vocabulary to ask about it yet, and I filed it away with everything else about this planet that I didn't understand but was starting to trust.